Edwin Canistracci having a drink in honor of the late and great Eddie Van Halen. That's to you, Eddie. Man, 2020. I know everyone's saying it, but unfortunately, our heroes, they're getting older. It happened with Lemmy a few years back. Then it happened with Malcolm Young, and now Eddie Van Halen. And it's very sad. It's very tragic. But Van Halen's music was life affirming. And just like ACDC, it's about not letting death bog you down, but keep on rocking. And that's the spirit I'm embracing tonight. And it's strange how this all worked out. That this week, we lost Eddie, but then we get a new ACDC single. You know, so that's how life goes. One door closes sadly, another door opens or continues. And ACDC, they've been here before, decades ago, back in black after Bon Scott died. They continued and they continued rocking. I remember being shocked when Malcolm Young, shortly after the Black Ice tour, he was diagnosed with dementia and he was no longer going to be part of ACDC. I mean, to me, maybe this is how some people felt about ACDC without Bon Scott back in 1980. But to me, it was like Malcolm. I mean, with all due respect to Bon Scott, the Young brothers formed this band. It was Angus and Malcolm. They were the two that formed ACDC. It was the brothers. They were the sound, Malcolm in one speaker, Angus in the other. Behind the scenes, Malcolm was the leader of the band and came up with so many of those classic riffs. On stage, it was the Angus show. They were still just young men in their 20s. Of course, they were going to continue and go on and find another singer. And they found the perfect singer in Brian Johnson. I actually don't feel any other singer could have replaced Bon Scott and been the right man for the job, because he was so authentic and working class, just like Bon was. He wasn't a star, He was a bloke. He was a bloke up on stage, but with charisma. Like he'd be the charming guy at the bar that everyone liked, and that's Brian Johnson, and that was Brian Johnson then, and that's still Brian Johnson today. And it took a guy like that to step in for Bon. That's the only way it would have worked. If it was some slicked up kind of rock star type, just wouldn't have worked. And Bon himself liked Brian, and they had toured together briefly in England with the fraternity, Bon's old band, and Geordie, Brian's old band. They played together in England for a bit there, and they did like each other. And Bon talked up Brian, and Angus and Malcolm remembered that after Bon's passing. And I know I'm digressing a little bit, drinking the whiskey here. It was like, first, I couldn't imagine ACDC without Malcolm Young. And so I was very weary of Rock or Bust when that came out a few years back. I was like, I don't know about this. ACDC without Malcolm Young? I mean, how's that even possible? How can you do that? Stevie Young was stepping in, and Stevie Young, he's family. He stepped in for Malcolm on the Blow Up Your Video tour, so he's been there before, but still, that was not quite the same situation. I couldn't imagine that you could have an AC/DC album without Malcolm Young. It still, was Angus, Cliff Williams, Phil Rudd, and Brian Johnson, so it still was most of the Back in Black lineup. So that helped. That helped a lot. That helped it to sound and feel like it was still a legitimate AC/DC album. But still, feeling like Malcolm wasn't there. But then I read and heard that a lot of these songs were based on riffs that Malcolm had knocked out himself and written himself. So they were using a lot of Malcolm's riffs in the music. So I thought, okay, that's a tribute. Of course they should do it. And I wasn't crazy about the first single, Play Ball. I wasn't, it was all right. But, I wasn't so crazy about Black Ice. It was all right. I thought it was just an all right AC/DC album. I thought Brian sounded great on it, and I liked the sound and the production. And a few of the songs I liked, but overall I thought it was too many songs, and I didn't like as much as Stiff Upper Lip or Ball Breaker, which I thought were bluesier, kind of more straight up, no nonsense AC/DC albums. Black Ice sounded like it was kind of catered a little bit to try to streamline them a little bit. Not as much as the Razor's Edge, but a little more so than those two albums were. And Play Ball sounded like it was something from Black Ice. So I was still a little reluctant. But then I heard the second single when the album came out, and I had the album, shipped to me that day. It was Rock or Bust, and that song I loved. I loved the title track. I loved Rock or Bust. That was just the kind of AC/DC I love. Hard rocking, no nonsense. And I listened to the album, and I really, really liked it. Actually, I loved it then. And I'll admit, I excited about the new album, and the fact that it was better than I was expecting and sounded so much like AC/DC, more so than I imagined it could without Malcolm, that I perhaps at the time overrated it. Like I even wrote an essay on my blog about how it's the best AC/DC album since Flick of the Switch, and I don't think that anymore. I wouldn't put it above Fly on the Wall or Ball Breaker or even Stiff Upper Lip. I wouldn't put it above those albums. But I definitely do think it's better than Black Ice. Essentially, it improved on everything that was Black Ice. And it was shorter, tighter, a little more straight up, but still a very strong production. And Brian sounded even better on that than he had sounded on Black Ice. And I went and saw the tour. It was one of the last shows that Brian Johnson played with the band in LA. I saw it, and Chris Slade was playing, unfortunately. That was another thing. Phil Rudd, I love Phil Rudd. And I was just so excited to see Phil, and that's, to me, was AC/DC. Like, if Malcolm's not there, at least it's Phil and Cliff and Brian and Angus. But then Phil wasn't going to be there. Chris Slade had replaced him because he got into some trouble. We know about Phil Rudd. He got into some trouble there. And New Zealand, he got into some trouble. He may or may not have had to try to get a woman whacked, but it didn't happen. Didn't go through with it. It was an option he considered for a period. That's it. It was just an option. He considered it, and that got him into some trouble. And there's some other stuff too, but we don't have to get into that. Listen, the man lives the lifestyle. He's a wild rock and roll guy. That's Phil Rudd. So, and unfortunately, that sometimes gets him kicked out of AC/DC every now and then. But so I was a little sad about that. But let me tell you something. It was still a great show. And Brian was the VIP of that show. He sounded great, and he was running around, and he was just so. I thought he was better. He was better then than back when I saw them at the second concert I ever went to as a young man, the Razor's Edge tour. That was the second concert I ever went to at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. They shot the Money Talks video there at the show I was at. And I thought Brian sounded even better, and his performance was better. It was awesome. Angus was great, but man, Brian was the VIP, and he was really bringing it. And considering his age, and at the time, I didn't know he was struggling with hearing at the time. So I was, afterwards, I was like, wow, Brian really delivered. And then all that stuff happened with his hearing, and suddenly he was not in AC/DC anymore, and Axl Rose had replaced him. And Axl, to his credit, he did a really good job. He was a real pro. The set list was great with Axl, and he did a good job. He delivered, but that wasn't AC/DC. I never would call that AC/DC. I called it Axl DC. It was a different thing because Phil Rudd wasn't in the band, Malcolm's not in the band, and then Brian's not in the band. It was just Angus and Cliff. So by that point, they were playing the songs, but with Axl singing, even though he was doing a great job, it was, in some songs, admittedly, because he's younger, his voice is a little stronger. Technically speaking, was probably hitting those notes, and his performance overall was perhaps a little stronger than Brian's. But, to me, it's not about hitting the notes right, I mean, that's the thing. Like, you could say Tommy Thayer hits certain notes more accurately than Ace Frehley, but he's not Ace Frehley. You still want to hear the man himself, because he brings that distinct personality. He brings that edge. Even if it's a sloppy edge, that's an Ace edge. And likewise, even if Brian is older now and he's not hitting all the notes like he used to, and he might not have that dangerous mean edge that he had back in the early 80s when he was hungry and needed to prove himself. And man, he could hit those notes like on Shoot to Thrill and throughout Flick of the Switch. I mean, even if he's not the singer that he was then, he's still Brian Johnson. He still has that swagger. He still has that atmosphere, and he still has that raspy, cool, distinct voice. And to me, that's part of AC/DC sound. I mean, that's the thing. There's some people that stopped like with Bon Scott, and like that's their AC/DC. But I came in like a lot of people, especially in my generation, with Brian Johnson as the singer of AC/DC. And to me, as much as I love Bon Scott, and AC/DC wouldn't have gotten to where they did without Bon Scott. And he laid the map. He laid the blueprint, the roadmap for Brian to follow. But still, Brian was like the quarterback. He helped them get that touchdown Back in Black and create something just as iconic and unique in its own way. Just like with Bon and Angus, now you had Brian and Angus, and that image of Brian with the flat cap. I still like the Bell and Cannon tour, when he's got the bandana and the Harley Davidson shirt and he's just gripping and screaming. To me, that's just as iconic AC/DC as Angus doing the duck walk in his schoolboy uniform, And Brian's wails and his rasp, that's as much of the sound of AC/DC, in my opinion, as Malcolm and Angus's guitar. And Phil Rudd's steady, awesome, doesn't miss a beat drumming. To me, AC/DC is a collective. It's not just the Young Brothers. It was a collective of these guys that came together. There was two great lineups, both of which are the same musicians, but with two singers. To me, it was like the Power Ridge Highway to Hell lineup with Cliff, Phil, Angus, and Malcolm. And then there was the Back in Black through Flick of the Switch lineup with Angus, Malcolm, Phil, Cliff, and Brian. So that's, to me, the two great lineups, which are essentially the same lineup with two singers. And both of those singers, Bon and Brian, are two of my favorite singers of all time, and they're both in my top 5 favorite singers. So, to me, I was like, hey, listen, I'll buy an Axl DC album. I'll give it. I'm sure it'll be good. It'll probably be anything better than Axl could do. I mean, Axl doesn't even make music on his own anymore. I mean, he took 15 years to make one all right album, and that's all it was, in my opinion, just all right. And Guns N' Roses had that big successful stadium tour, but did it produce an album? No, they didn't do one album. Like Van Halen, when they did their reunion tour with Dave, Eddie and Dave, they did a different kind of Truth. They did a new album and it kicked ass. In my opinion, their best album since Diver Down, or maybe even Fair Warning. It was I liked it better in 1984. That was an amazing album. So they produced something. They got together. Wolfgang brought them together, and they did a great album. And now, especially now, we see how great it was that they were able to do that. That we actually got to get some more classic Van Halen music from Eddie and Dave, and what a gift that was. And Guns N' Roses didn't do that. You know why? They wouldn't even let Izzy in the band? Izzy asked for too much money, and they wouldn't bring him in. I'm digressing a bit, but it's just there's a difference between doing things for money and doing things because you want to create something. And that's the thing. Like Guns N' Roses, to my disappointment, weren't interested in creating anything. They weren't interested in getting Izzy and Steve back and making another album. They just wanted to go on and do a show and have Axl next to a guy with a top hat so that lots of people can come and play the old songs. And, that's fine, but that's not what I'm about. I'm about new music. I want to hear new music from the bands I love. And that's why I was so happy when I found out like a year ago when those pictures leaked that Brian Johnson, Cliff Williams, and Phil Rudd, like to me, Phil Rudd even, that they were all back with Angus making a new album up there in Canada. I was like, shit, I didn't see that coming. If you would have told me a few years ago that we were still going to get the Back in Black lineup minus Malcolm back for another album again, I would have said you're dreaming. Not going to happen. Between Brian's hearing problems, Phil's legal problems, Cliff retiring, it was done. It wasn't going to happen. But Angus did it. They all came together. They came together at Malcolm's funeral. He saw them all, and Angus, he went with his heart. He was like, yeah, these are the guys. These are the guys that I've been through decades with. These are the guys that we recorded our biggest album with. These are the guys, these are my fucking mates. We might all be spread around the globe now. Brian and Cliff live in Florida. Angus lives in Sydney. Phil's in New Zealand, causing trouble. But yet we all came together at Sydney for, Malcolm's funeral. And they're there with Stevie and his family. And it's like, fuck it, let's do it. Let's make this work somehow. And they made it work. And Brian utilized technology. And he's got this like special hearing aid or something now that helped him with his hearing. And Phil, he took care of his legal issues and he's a free man again. And they forgave him. Could you imagine that? Look at some bands. Like, if a guy got into as much trouble as Phil Rudd, they'd kick him to the curb. But Angus didn't. And that says something about his character. He's like, you're my fucking mate. We go back to, TNT, man. You were there with Malcolm and Bon. So no, You're back. I don't give a shit what crazy shit you were doing there in New Zealand. You're back, and you're the best goddamn drummer AC/DC ever had, and you are part of the sound. Part of that sound. Phil Rudd is such an underrated member of the band, and I love this guy. So he was like, "You're back," and then Cliff's watching this and going, "Yeah, of course I want to be in on this too. Of course, the band's getting back together. It's like the Blues Brothers. We're putting the band back together." And they get together, these guys, these old fucking geezers. I love them. I love these guys. And I love that they got back together, you know? And even if this is the last time, man, thank you. Thank you guys for getting back together. And we needed it more than ever. In 2020, we needed another AC/DC album more than ever. We need rock and roll. Between the pandemic, all this division and people fighting each other over politics and bullshit. And then Eddie Van Halen, losing Eddie Van Halen, one of the greatest guitarists of the 20th century. This is when we need AC/DC. And I'm sorry, people are going to have their taste and their opinions, but if you listen to this song and you go, "Oh, that's generic," well, let me tell you something about generic. A, it's not generic because the very definition of generic is something that's indistinct and not specific and not like a brand. It's just like it would be any hard rock, like hard rock, but you don't know who the band is. And there's no way you can tell me you listen to one note of this song and don't know it's AC/DC. You could say it's unimaginative. You could say it's formulaic. You could say, "Oh, it's just the same old AC/DC shit." But you can't say it's generic because it is so AC/DC. And if you love AC/DC down to your bones and they're one of your favorite bands and you've loved them since you were in junior high, then there's no way, as soon as you hear that guitar, as soon as you hear that bluesy guitar and it's got that "have a drink on me" vibe, and groove, and it sounds like something. This sounds like it's one of the Malcolm riffs to me. How can you not immediately just get that feeling? I don't care if it's something that's similar to what they've done before, I mean, that's the thing. I love James Brown. After Cold Sweat, he did a lot of songs that sounded like that. Like he got a sound and then he stuck with it. Motorhead did that. Chuck Berry did it. Muddy Waters did it. The Ramones did it. Like some bands are just like that. Some artists are like that. They get a sound and they stick with it. And that's great. Not everything's got to be progressive and evolving. And sometimes they just give you their sound. And AC/DC, they got their sound now. They're not you're not going to get stuff like "For Those About to Rock," "We Salute You" anymore. You're not going to get things that are like real curveballs. You're not going to hear a song like "Who Made Who." You're not going to get stuff like that anymore. And this kind of started with Ballbreaker. From Ballbreaker on, you pretty much just get bluesy, straight up, for the most part, mid-tempo hard rock. That's what you get. But it sounds like AC/DC doing bluesy, mid-tempo hard rock. You have Phil's drums, you have Angus's guitar, and you got the sound. You got Brian's voice. And Brian, he still brings it. Yeah, he can't scream and hit really crazy notes like he used to. But man, he still sounds he still sounds awesome. He sounds awesome. He just sounds tough. True grit, That's what it is. It's true grit. That's what you hear in his vocals. I love that sound. I love the sound of Brian Johnson. And I'd rather hear Johnson in his 70s than any other singer with that band. This man earned it. This man went through a history with the band. This man helped AC/DC get over Bon Scott's death and take shit to the next level. That's what this man did. And that's why I don't want to hear anyone else singing with AC/DC. They can go off. Angus could do other things afterwards if he wants and play with Axl and other, singers if he wants to do another album. But AC/DC is with these guys. It's with Phil, Cliff, and Brian. And I'll say Stevie now too. He's earning his stripes. He's blood. And he's been there. So this is the band. And maybe this is the last one. Maybe there'll be others. But I know I just love this song. I've listened to it like 8 times today. 8 times. Maybe it's the pandemic. I don't know. Maybe it's losing Eddie. I don't know. But it's just something I feel it's so righteous, and it's just what we need right now. We need rock and roll. And it's no nonsense. It's straight up. It's just groovy. I think it's better than Play Ball and Rock and Roll Train. So this is right now my favorite lead single from an AC/DC album. since Stiff Upper Lip. So, and it's kind of like Stiff Upper Lip meets Have a Drink on Me. And I love it. It's bluesy, down and dirty, and I just can't get enough of it. And I'm so excited about this album. So excited. Power Up. I mean, that's like Powerage, which is my favorite AC/DC album. And I just look at these song titles. They're going to be great. Realize, that's interesting. Sounds a little different. Rejection. Through the Mist of Time. Whoa, what's going on here? That almost sounds like a Zeppelin type of title. Kick You When You're Down. Witch's Spell. Demon's Fire. Wild Reputation. No Man's Land. Systems Down. Money Shot. And Code Red. Man, this album's going to be awesome. I already know it's awesome. I can't wait to listen to it. And I see that album cover with the righteous red glowing AC/DC over the warehouse of unused instruments and amps and guitars. And it's like the band's been in hibernation. It's been down. It's been locked down like all of us. But now AC/DC's coming to charge us all up. The power up. We're going to move into 2021. We're going to get through all this bullshit. Leave 2020 in the dust. And 2021 is going to kick ass. And that's what this song makes me feel like. That's what that album cover makes me feel like. And that's how I'm feeling now. So do I like the new AC/DC single? Fuck yeah, I love it. I love it. Rock on.